Well, good evening, everybody. We'll get started. Welcome and glad you're here with us on a cold night with a lot of snow outside. My name is Pat Phillips, and I'm honored to be president of the Green Mountain Audubon Society, which is a chapter of Audubon Vermont that covers Chittenden, Franklin, and Grand Isle counties. We're one of about 5 chapters of Audubon. And just so that you don't get confused, Green Mountain Audubon, like I said, covers Chittenden, Franklin, and Grand Isle counties, and is a distinct agency, but we work closely together with Audubon Vermont, which is centered in Huntington. If you belong to the Audubon magazine and live in either of those 3 counties, you are automatically assigned to be a member of Green Mountain Audubon. We want to thank you for your membership, and we also want to thank many of you for generous donations that you've offered in the past. These funds have helped to support programs like this one tonight and numerous outings and conservation activities. In addition, funds help to provide scholarships for students to attend camps at the Audubon Center in Huntington. It's supported a variety of environmentally related projects in schools and communities, and have also funded much needed renovation at the Audubon Center. If you're interested in joining Green Mountain Audubon, I will paste a link in the chat and you can go from there. One of the other things we frequently want to recognize is that the area within which we operate is part of the ancestral lands of the Abnakis. This area has been held sacred by the indigenous people for years. The Abnaki were the traditional caretakers of these lands and waters. We respect their connection to this region and remember the hardships they continue to endure. And last, we give thanks for the opportunity to share this place and endeavor to work to protect it. This evening, we are delighted to have a wonderful speaker, and just so I don't forget it, during the course of the presentation, if you have questions, just type them in the chat, and you can reach the chat feature down at the bottom of your screen if you scroll down to, or if you move your cursor down to there. And at the end of the presentation, a number of those, you'll have the opportunity for those questions to be answered. So I'm really pleased tonight to welcome wildlife biologist Jillian Kilborn. She serves as the coordinator for the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife's non-game program. In this position, she works closely with a variety of individuals to conserve, monitor, and manage birds throughout Vermont. She also assists in the state lands management in the St. Johnsbury district. Prior to joining her Vermont colleagues in 2023, Jill had a 23-year career with New Hampshire Fish and Game focused on the management of state lands and the conservation of threatened and endangered species. Jill earned her undergraduate degree in wildlife management from the University of New Hampshire and has a graduate degree in wildlife conservation from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. We're grateful for the work that she is doing and very appreciative of the time that she's taking to give this presentation this evening. And she's coming live from way up near Island Pond to discuss Vermont grasslands and how the changes in agricultural practice have presented challenges to the many avian species who avail themselves of those habitats. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jillian. And Jillian, take it away.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that introduction. That was great. So yeah, my name is Jill Kilborn, and I am the Nongame Bird project leader for Vermont Fish and Wildlife. So like was mentioned, let me see if I can get this to advance. It's not going. We'll try that. Okay. So just a little bit of background about Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department for those of you that aren't familiar with the department. The general mission of the department is the conservation of all of our fish, wildlife, plants, and habitats for the people of Vermont. So under this mission, a lot of people don't realize how many different areas that we actually cover within the department. So we do work within natural communities and habitats. We work with fish. We work with invertebrates, we work with all the wildlife in the state, and we cover the plants in the state of Vermont as well through our Natural Heritage Program. And this is all to serve all the public here in Vermont, not only wildlife watchers and our future generations, but also the anglers and hunters and trappers of our constituents, but also communities, working with a lot of the towns out there in Vermont, and also a variety of different landowners. So specifically, the bird program lies within the wildlife diversity program within Vermont Fish and Wildlife. And that diversity program covers, like I was mentioning, mammals. So any of the T&E species or mammals that are not hunted or trapped fall underneath the diversity program. We also cover reptiles and amphibians in the state, all the invertebrates, as well as bird community, which we'll be talking about tonight. And then, of course, the plant and natural communities that are covered by our natural heritage program. I always like to put my plug in here for how people can help the program specifically. So there's a variety of different ways that people can contribute to the department, not only through buying a hunting and fishing license, but there's 3 different options that we kind of put out as part of the diversity program. So the first is actually known as the Threatened Endangered Species Non-Game Wildlife Fund. And there's direct links on the websites where you can make contributions to each of these. The second is the Habitat Stamp program that we run, and this program is specifically used to fund habitat work that happens on our WMAs. And then, of course, the Conservation and Heritage license plates that help fund our natural heritage program and different watershed work that's done statewide. So tonight we'll be talking through a little bit about the bird project with Vermont Fish and Wildlife, just to give you guys some context on the program and where we've been and where we're going. And then we're going to take a deep dive into the grassland bird habitat management, specifically thinking about what the requirements are to manage grassland habitat and the different approaches that we're thinking about, some of the struggles and the things that we're trying to change based on historic management. And then we're going to go through an example that we're working on specifically on one of our wildlife management areas, or WMAs. So I'll kind of introduce the wildlife management areas and give a specific example of a place that we're looking to do some management over the next 5-year period. So the bird project covers a little over 250 species that are found here in Vermont, and these include anything that's a resident year-round to our seasonal visitors, both migratory in the summertime and then some of our visitors that come down during the winter months into Vermont. So a lot of the coordination and implementation for this project happens at the statewide level. So we're working with a bunch of different partners to implement all this work. We are representing at a regional level, and then we'll also talk about a little of the outreach, the disease, and the regulatory work that's covered by the department. I also like to kind of put a plug in for how all this work is funded, just to give people a little bit more of a picture of how the department works. So the Pittman-Robertson Act, which was put into place in 1937, is a 11% tax that goes into the federal government on guns and ammunition. Those funds are then reallocated to all the states by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to each of the states to fund each of the state wildlife departments. The states are then required to provide at least a 25% match for these funds. And historically, that was primarily done through the sale of hunting and fishing licenses. So there's an equivalent for the fishing side of funding. Now that our responsibilities and the work that we do has become so much more diverse, it actually requires a lot more of filling the gaps. So Pittman-Robertson funds can only be used on birds and mammals here in the state. So all the work that we do with invertebrates, with reptiles and amphibians, anything that doesn't fall in fur or feathers needs to find other funding sources to get that work done. So about almost 30 years ago now, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service started a program where the states were required to write wildlife action plans, which coalesced all the information that they could find on different wildlife species in the state, identified priorities to work with, and that the federal government has another source of funding that they provide called state wildlife grants to help fill the gap on some of those projects that were identified in our wildlife action planning process. That is an annual appropriation, and as I think we're all learning, annual appropriations can be very vulnerable, and they're not a stable source of funding for a lot of this work, so it makes it really difficult to implement on the ground. And for many, many years, we've been trying to pass what's known as Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which is essentially the equivalent to Pittman-Robertson, only for everything else that's not covered by that act. So it includes everything from outreach work to covering plants, hopefully in the new act, which would just be really critical to furthering the work in the state for all these species. So before I dive too much into where we're going, I think it's really important to talk about where we've been as the bird project specifically. I think everybody can remember, or we talk often about the days when bald eagles were not common in the state, or peregrine falcons and ospreys. And so a lot of the work that has been done historically in this program was very much focused on T&E species and species that declined dramatically due to DDT and things like that. I think it's great that we can now say that these species are well on their way to recovery, if not recovered. Bald eagles are doing really good in the state. We still monitor nests statewide with Audubon, Vermont. Peregrines are also doing really well. So it's really success stories that come along with the long history of the program and the partnerships that we've had over the years. But as I'm sure everybody is aware on this call, we have a lot more work to do. So the recent work that has come out by Rosenberg et al. In 2019 talks about 3 billion birds lost over the last 50 years, threw up red flags for a lot of folks, especially in the bird world, who I like to think of it as kind of a shifting baseline thing where if you're new to birding or you're just getting into birding and just observing, like what you observe now is very different from what somebody probably observed 50 years ago. And so having that perspective and these long-term monitoring projects are really important to understanding these declines and the different suites of species and how they're being impacted over time by our activities primarily. So in that study, one of the primary groups of birds that is experiencing the biggest decline was the grassland bird community. So we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into that and talk about those changes and what's possibly driving those declines. Where we are going as a bird program here in Vermont Fish and Wildlife. Threatened and endangered species are always going to be a big component of the work that we do. There's a long list of birds that are on this list here that are state listed. There's only one federally listed, and that's red knot, and we have very low, if no, occurrence of red knots in the state of Vermont. But I think the thing to note about this slide is that many of the species that we're thinking about and the way that we're kind of transitioning that thinking is more at the habitat scale or at the habitat level. So all those species that are listed in yellow are all associated with grassland habitat and are all listed or will be uplisted, such as the grasshopper sparrow that we're possibly thinking of uplisting to endangered in the state of Vermont. So grassland habitat is definitely high on the radar and high on our priority list of one of the habitats that we need to deal with here in the state. As I was mentioning, the Wildlife Action Plan is actually the planning process that the program uses to kind of frame the work that we're going to be doing over the next 10-year period. We are currently in the middle of our 10-year update for that plan. So we are starting the process. Over the last year, we went through all of the species that we have identified as what we call SGCN, or species of greatest conservation need. And so we're going through that list, updating ones that we think that we could take off, ones that can go on based on their status, and then figuring out all the threats and possible actions that we could take to try and address each of those species. And again, I can't emphasize enough the importance of the partner collaborations that we have here in Vermont. We're super fortunate to have some great nonprofit partners, including Audubon Vermont and Vermont Center of Eco Studies, and I'll cover those a little bit more. The department also works really closely with Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation for all the ways that we manage our state lands. And obviously we work very closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on all these projects. So over the years, we've been really involved with Audubon Vermont in funding primarily work with the species here on the screen. So as I was mentioning, Margaret fowl has been a great resource and really has been the foundation to the eagle and peregrine work that has happened in the state. And we continue to do monitoring of those species just to keep a pulse on what's going on. And I think a perfect example of that is some of the recent issues that have popped up with avian influenza and the potential impacts that AI is having on these species. We also do quite a bit of work with common terns out on the islands in Lake Champlain, working with Mark Labar, and then also with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with the black tern population on Champlain, and then of course with grasshopper sparrows and a variety of sites that Audubon Vermont helps us with. There's a hand up. Do I need to take a break? All right. Seems like we're okay.
I think you're okay, Jill.
All right, great. Our other partner that we tend to work with quite a bit on a variety of bird projects is Vermont Center of Eco Studies. Obviously, they are a great foundation and resource here in the state of Vermont, doing lots of really important research and work. Specifically, the programs that we've been working with them on include loon monitoring, which has been a long-term project working with Eric Hansen at VC. But we've also been working with eastern meadowlarks and trying to get a better handle on their distribution in the state and writing a recovery plan for eastern meadowlarks since they've been listed. And then, of course, whippoorwills have been the other species that we've been working with. So VCA has been responsible for writing the recovery plan for that species, as well as coordinating volunteers on a variety of survey lines that are done statewide. Regional collaboration really is centered around what's known as the Atlantic Flyway Council, which is the regional group that gets together for all the state agencies. So all the state agencies have representatives that come together, from non-game bird program coordinators to waterfowl coordinators to the bear project, moose project, and they all get together at least twice a year to discuss regional issues that come up across state lines. The other big one for the bird community and the bird project is the Partners in Flight initiative and the different working groups that have come out of Partners in Flight. Two of the regional projects that we're currently working on as part of the program is the MODIS wildlife tracking system. So the department helps to receive funds from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to implement MODIS towers on the ground, maintain them, and then projects that are using those towers as part of the research process. And the other one that we've recently collaborated on is with Pennsylvania Game Commission, which is currently funding a regional project to survey essentially across the Northeast as best we can for goshawks, because there's a real concern in the decline of goshawks across the region. There's quite a bit of outreach and education that happens in the program. I'm hoping that some of you are seeing that outreach in the work that we do, but there are multiple links on our website specifically for bird watching and different resources for birds. And we also try and do quite a bit of outreach through social media such as Facebook and Instagram. These is a big part of some of the coordination that happens in the project. Obviously, with the uptick in avian influenza, it's been kind of a hot button issue, taking lots of calls from members of the public who have different birds that they're finding. So we have resources on the website for folks to get to, and definitely trying to keep a finger on that pulse to understand how it's impacting populations in the state. And then finally, the big chunk of the work that happens under the project is the regulatory work. So not only serving on the bird SAG for the threatened endangered species work, but also We now have the Grassland Bird Guidance, which is the document that identifies grassland habitat as a habitat that can be considered under criteria 8 in Act 250. So we are able to provide comment on impacts to grassland habitat for different development projects as a result of that guidance document that we have. All right, so now let's get into the fun stuff where we start talking about wildlife management areas and grassland birds and the different initiatives that the department has for trying to manage these habitats specifically for grassland birds. So as I was mentioning, grassland birds have been declining in that study over the 50-year period. It's been about a 34% decline in grassland birds across the North America and Canada. And we feel a lot of that decline has been driven by habitat conversion, tree and shrub encroachment, and possible pesticide application or use. So the species that we're specifically talking about here in Vermont that this would pertain to that we have here using our grasslands here in Vermont are things like bobolinks, meadowlarks, savanna sparrows, and all those other ones that are listed there on the screen. I think the other one that's important to note here are grasshopper sparrows that are still on our landscape, but are being lost at a pretty quick pace for sure. So why do grassland birds need management? So here in Vermont, we're super fortunate to have an active agricultural landscape with active farming. But this really is the foundation of the habitat for the birds, and there can be conflict in the way that the grasslands are managed in providing habitat for the grassland birds, and for the farmers getting what they need from the fields that they're maintaining and managing. So grassland habitat is very ephemeral here in Vermont. Like if we all know, if we don't maintain grassland habitat, eventually the trees are going to take over and will come into those field habitats. It is one of the primary habitats that's also been identified for development. It's much easier to go in and plop a house in the middle of a field that's already cleared, that is flat, that is drained, than it is to go in and try and clear a spot in the forest. And it's really prone to the changes in our agricultural use. So as our farms get bigger and cows spend more time in the barn and less time out in the fields and grazing, and the impacts of needing to mow on a higher rotation schedule to provide food for more animals on the landscape are all contributing factors to the loss of grassland bird habitat. And grassland birds are vulnerable when nesting. They're on the ground nesting, and the different conditions make them very, very vulnerable to predation or to mortality due to different management practices. So I like to kind of start at the very top and provide kind of a hierarchy or the way that a biologist is trained to think about habitat. So we're told that the best way to kind of break it down is to think about what the geographic range is for a species. So when we talk about grassland species here in Vermont, obviously their native habitat was originally the tall grass prairies, primarily in the Midwest. But as agriculture kind of took over that landscape, and we lost more and more of that habitat, we found many of those grassland species started moving east, especially as the east increased in the amount of agriculture that we had in cleared lands. So it was really an expansion that happened. And now at this point, it is believed that even the Northeast between New York and Vermont and some of the other open habitats, we are supporting upwards of 20% of the bobolink population here in America or North America. So this is just a slide that kind of shows that original Midwest tall grass prairie area. And as you can see, it's really been whittled down to very small chunks. Some estimates have even said that it's down to less than 90% of the original habitat that's available for these species now. So the importance of our habitats here in Vermont are that much more important because we're filling some of that gap that has been lost in the Midwest for sure. So the next thing in the hierarchy of habitats that we think about is the size and shape of a habitat. So you're drilling down to a little bit lower scale or a little bit finer resolution on the landscape and really figuring out like, okay, on the landscape, where are these birds going to want to be? And a lot of it comes down to the size and the shape of the fields that we have here in Vermont. So many of these species like really open landscapes. They like large fields, and they don't like a lot of obstructions in those fields. So they don't like to have trees growing. They don't like the shrubs. They really like to have open grassland habitat. We talk a lot about the size and the shape of the field being really important. So a lot of people come to us looking to manage for grassland birds, and they may have really strangely shaped fields or long, narrow fields or really small fields, and less than 5 acres. And from a grassland bird standpoint, those are just not ideal. Like they want big, round, or areas that have lots of interior, because that's where they feel the safest when it comes to nesting. On the edges is where the predators tend to pick off a lot of these species. So over time, they've just learned being in the interior or in the center of these areas is the best place to be from a nesting standpoint. One of the other tools that is really interesting and is been very handy to look at when we're thinking about this is what we're calling topographic openness. And this is using geographic information systems, and they have a data set that's called LIDAR, which is a data set that sends a bunch of light down to the ground, and it reflects back, and then they can map what the actual terrain of the landscape looks like and how high different objects are. And so this model here is showing the areas in red are the most open and probably the most appealing to a grassland bird looking to pick a spot on the landscape for nesting. So it really gives us a tool to kind of focus in on the places that are most critical as habitat for these species. It's super data intensive and really hard to map statewide. So we usually tend to use this tool just on small projects or areas at this point to get a handle on the best places for birds on different projects. So now we're getting down to that very last level in habitat, and it's really coming down to like what is within those fields. What is the structure and the composition within those fields that's appealing to the different species? So obviously we like the fields to be full of grass, non-woody species, and we're really finding that invasive plants are an important thing not to have in these fields, that the birds are selecting places and really want to have the native tall grass or cool and warm season grasses in these habitats and not the invasive plants. So when we talk about vegetative structure, just like our forests are diverse in structure, once you like get into the forest and you start thinking about all the different birds and all the different levels of the forest that the birds use, grass is no different. It's just at a different scale. If you get down into that grass and start looking around, the birds are picking different fields based on different characteristics, whether the grass is tall, whether it's short, if there's a lot of litter down on the base of the grass where it's coming out of the ground, if there's even micro topography within the field. So if a place has been, say, grazed by a bunch of cattle and there's a bunch of hoof prints that have created little divots, some of our species actually will select those types of habitats for that structure specifically. So in our management, we're looking to try and enhance or maintain all of these features. So I just thought that this was a really good diagram that kind of shows the full spectrum and the continuum of all the different species and kind of where they lie. So as you move up in height or density of vegetation, you move to the right on this graph. As you move up, increased litter layer. So the denser the litter layer is down close to the bottom of the grasses, close to the ground. So as you can see, like it's a full spectrum of where species are going to fall and the different conditions that we're trying to maintain. So digging a little deeper for some of the species here in Vermont. So our midgrass species, so the species that like grasses that are kind of medium height, but fairly dense, include things like bobolinks, eastern meadowlarks, and savanna sparrows. Meadowlarks are that species that when an area is grazed, they really seem to key in on those small topographic changes and the divots that are created from grazing, as well as that duff layer for creating their nest. And then one of the short grass or sparse grass species that we have here in the state is of course the grasshopper sparrow. They tend to be in places that have more sandy soils that are more nutrient poor, and as a result, you get that more sparse vegetation, more open, and these birds really seem to like that condition. So how do we get from all those 3 different layers, drill down through all of those, put all those pieces together and figure out how to do management on the ground? So first is just prioritizing fields by their size. When we have places with 100+ acres of field that are in open condition, suitable for a variety of species, we think of species like upland sandpipers being on that landscape and try and managing for those species. Eastern meadowlarks, grasshopper sparrows, bobolinks, and anything below are all going to fall into that 60+ category. And then bobolinks really are probably one of the most flexible from an area standpoint of all the species. And they can use places all the way down to kind of 10 acres in size. But we kind of think of that 20-acre threshold as kind of what we're aiming for on the landscape in general. So the different tools that we're talking about for managing the habitat for the birds includes mowing and haying, which is one of the primary things that people think about when we talk about grassland birds here in the state. But as I was mentioning, grazing is also a really important tool. We'd love to see more burning happening because we think that could make some really great structure for habitat. And then, of course, we often have to think about planting and restoration, which comes often through crop rotation. And then we're seeing that this is probably a tool that we're going to have to use more and more of, especially as we're dealing with invasives on our landscape and how we figure out ways to deal with invasives and restoring habitat after they've taken over the landscape. So when we talk about mowing timing, historically, I think the next slide. Historically, we all often told people the best thing that you could do for grassland birds was to mow after August 15th. It was okay if it had to happen sometime after August 1st. Most species are probably fledged by then. It was kind of on the edge if you did it around July 15th. And then anything prior to that, we would ask for a 65-day window. So if you tried to do an early mowing, say in the first week of May, we'd ask for a 65-day period of no mow, and then you could mow after that point. But this is all shifting because of invasives on the landscape and the impacts that we're seeing in this delayed mowing regime that we've been recommending. So the big ones that we're seeing, especially in the Champlain Valley, include wild parsnip, bedstraw, knapweed. Yellow rattle hasn't become so much of an issue in the Champlain Valley, but it's definitely on the radar for a variety of different folks. So the picture here is of wild parsnip. And I don't know how many of you recognize it, but it is rampant in the right-of-ways in Vermont. I think it's the primary way that is probably spread throughout the state. And it quickly, it has a 2-year cycle where it sends up vegetation and a flower head. And then the second year, it sends that flower head back up, and that's when it produces all the seed. So you have essentially a 2-year window to really get on top of it. If you get outside of that, there's so many seeds produced by these plants that it just spreads like wildfire on the landscape. Once it is in a field and the seeds have fallen from one of the plants, they can remain viable in the soil for up to 5 years. So it then becomes a long-term issue that you're going to be dealing with in that field. So one of the other things before we dive deeper into some of the things that we're recommending on the WMA is just minimizing disturbance in fields as well is really important. I can't say enough about minimizing not only activity in a field when you have nesting birds in there, because when you have activity, it can draw predators in. They can kind of key in on different scents and the movement of people through fields and trails, but also the importance of keeping cats indoors because cats are one of the primary predators of birds nationwide. Okay, so wildlife management areas. Statewide, Vermont Fish and Wildlife has 105 different wildlife management areas, and we own over 131,000 acres throughout that network of wildlife management areas. The properties range anywhere from 60 acres to 23,000 acres, and it makes up about 9% of the conserved land here in Vermont. The WMAs are made up of a variety of habitats, but the overall purpose of those WMAs is the maintenance of habitat for wildlife. And so we are in the business of maintaining ephemeral habitats like grasslands, but also we do forest management specifically for wildlife to enhance habitat for all variety of species. The WMA that we're going to talk about today is the Lemon Fair WMA, which is located in Cornwall. And so if you can see my cursor, this is Dead Creek up here. This is the main section of the Lemon Fair WMA. And the parcel that we're specifically going to be looking at today is a recent acquisition from the department got last year. We've referred to it as the Gorton parcel. And it's just a great example of some really good grassland bird habitat. So this is the property zoomed in with that openness model laid over the top of it that I showed you before. And as you can see, there's a variety of different fields on the habitat that are identified here as A, B, C, and D. A is kind of the highest elevation or the highest in topography up close to the main road. And as you move down, you get close to the Lemon Fair River, which is the river down here on the side of the WMA. So as you can see, some of these really big fields pop out as really open and really great habitat for grassland birds, but there's a lot of great habitat on the WMA as well. But I think the key piece to this slide is acknowledging that we need to keep these places as open as possible because they're teetering on the edge of being ideal habitat for a lot of these species. This parcel is also really great because it's in close proximity to an active farm that we've been collaborating with already in managing on the WMA. But he's also been farming the recent acquisition that we picked up in his family for a really long time as well. So he has a long history with the property, and we just really want to foster that relationship that we have with the farmer because it really is one of the best ways for us to get the work done on the ground. The other amazing piece about this property is that we've gone in and done some, well, that's the picture of the farmer, that's Eugene. And just reiterate the objectives for the project itself. And I think the other key piece to this project is the demonstration of the different options that we're going to have for grassland birds in the state. So this is a map of the surveys that we ran this past spring to kind of understand where the birds were on the property, what was using it, and the different parts or fields that were being keyed in on for the different species. So we had eastern meadowlarks. We're using this kind of northern portion as well as the low area down by the Lemon Fair. We had lots of bobolink activity on this property, and then we had some detections of grasshopper sparrows, which was a little unexpected, but welcomed, because we knew that the habitats were really diverse and really great on the property. The other thing worth mentioning is the habitats that kind of abut all these fields are great scrub-shrub habitat. And we actually had golden wing warbler detections in our surveys as well. So just more to think about in our management activities that we do on the property. So as I was saying, invasives have become an issue on this piece of property. Parsnip is essentially completely invaded the areas that are shown in red, with sparse detections located throughout the rest of the field in scrub-shrub habitat. So dealing with the parsnip has become one of the priorities for the management of the parcel. Some of the other species that we found included buckthorn, honeysuckle, and multiflora rose, which all are going to play into the management that we're going to be doing over the next 5-year period. So here's our resulting map that kind of shows the plan for this upcoming year. And it is a little complex, so I'll walk folks through it. On this northern field, we're actually going to try and till these fields up here and plant it to crop. Because if you remember from the previous map, it was the field that was completely inundated by parsnips. So we feel like the best way to deal with that is to remove the vegetation, crop it for 3 years, and then replant it back into vegetation for meadowlarks, hoping that we can entice them to use this part of the parcel again. We feel like this is okay because Eugene grazes his cattle all through the field just to the north of the parcel. And the meadowlarks were actually spending quite a bit of time up in that area. The second part of the project is this field here, which we're calling 2A and 2B. This was the field that had the most bobolink activity. And again, we had quite a bit of parsnip in this field. So this is where our little bit of a different management recommendation is coming into play. We are hoping to mow this field as soon as we can confirm that the bobolinks have fledged. So we're going to have biologists out there on the ground to see when that happens, but we're hoping we can mow that field probably the second week of July to try and get the parsnip before it goes to seed, which is usually right in that mid-July window. And then the third area that we have going on are the areas shown in purple with the hatching in it. This area is going to be fenced off, and we are going to have Eugene move his cattle into this area for the 3-month period of the nesting season. We are doing this at an extremely low density. So this area represents about 50 acres. And we're hoping to put less than 20 cows or cattle in this area at that time. So really low density for grazing, just to try and create that lower vegetation and sparser vegetation that the grasshopper sparrow liked and sometimes the meadowlark likes. And then finally, we have the field 5A, which we're going to try the double mow prescription, which means the farmer will be able to go in there, mow it before the second week of May, wait the 65-day window, and then go back and mow again to see what kind of condition that creates and species use that we create in that field over time. So I think the key piece to this slide and some of this work is, again, trying some different timing regimes for mowing when you have to deal with invasives on the landscape. But that is really dependent on having a good handle on the birds, where the birds are nesting and when they're fledging their young. And then the other piece is really playing with grazing on our landscape, because most of the research that's out there, most of the work that has been done is based on work from the Midwest and agricultural landscapes in the Midwest. So we don't have a good handle on what that's going to look like here in the East. So hoping lots of good lessons that are going to come out of that work specifically. So I think that might have been the last slide that I had for the WMA management. So I guess we can open it up to questions if anybody has them.
Jill, I'm going to jump to one question that came up right away, and it relates directly to your work down near the Lemon Fair. How do you remove the wild parsnip?
Yeah, so you so parsnip is the one of the species that has, if you cut it and you get the liquid on your skin, it can actually cause blisters. So it's a really not something that we recommend people go out and try and pull. And it's sunlight that activates that reaction. So you can pull it if you do it at dusk when the sun is down. And they do recommend sometimes being able to dig the plants and pull them that way. And that's only if you have a few plants out there that you can kind of control it that using that. We're going to actually end up using herbicide on the property to treat. And it's just because it's so pervasive and across so much of the WMA that it's really the only way that I think we're going to be able to get a handle on it.
Great. My friend Ken Copenhaver has a question. Do you have any updates on the Franklin County Airport habitat replacement project for grasshopper sparrows? And specifically, has there been any progress, and how will it be monitored and evaluated for effectiveness?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So Roz Renfrew is the diversity program manager that works for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and she's really been heading up that work. And she would be the best contact for that question because I'm not in that circle at this point.
Yeah. Okay, great. I know that was a topic of a lot of concern for folks. Tom Hargy wants to know, Vermont Agency of Natural Resources has recently given a certificate of public good to a 5 megawatt solar project on a hayfield in Georgia, Vermont. Eastern meadowlarks are known to be present on the impacted land. What involvement does Fish and Wildlife have in the A&R decisions on specific projects like that?
Sure. Yeah, so we are provided the opportunity to provide feedback in that situation, and we did provide comment on that project. When there is a listed species that's involved in a project, and there's a takings permit that is needed, that is then reviewed by the SAG or the Scientific Advisory Committee, and then the Endangered Species Committee. So when there's a listed species, it moves up through those committees for comment and for permitting. But as for the actual Act 250 and Act 248 process, it moves through that. If they don't meet the requirements that we have, they end up often paying mitigation for the loss of that habitat so that we can apply it somewhere else on the landscape.
Okay, great. Phoebe asks, when you talk about scrub habitat, what's the plant community like there? Are there your typical grassland species, or is it more like old field species?
It's more like old field species and species that like often like dense regenerating trees or early successional species that are coming up. So it's almost, I think of it like a soft edge to a field where you get grass habitat, then you start getting woody vegetation, and then it kind of transitions into forest. So those are the species that you tend to find in that scrub shrub habitat.
Okay, great. Bruce asks, would you discuss where the state funding for non-game birds comes from and how it compares to funding for game bird management?
Yeah, so the game bird and non-game birds come from the same pot. So that's the point I was trying to make with the Pittman Robinson funds. So PR dollars are the dollars that come in for mammals and birds in Vermont. And so that's the wildlife side. Dingle Johnson is the fisheries side. And then the state wildlife grants covers the other species that aren't mammals or birds. So we're super fortunate that we're able to put the non-game birds into that same bucket here in Vermont because not all states do it that way. But Vermont is progressive enough to realize that that funding should be used across species, whether hunted or not.
Mm-hmm. Jill, I wanted to ask about the work that you did down near the Lemon Fair looked quite intensive. The research and sort of the planning. Are there other projects similar to that happening in other places in Vermont?
So we do have grassland habitat projects that are happening, none necessarily at the scale that we've started at the Lemon Fair yet. Eagle Point WMA that's located up in Newport, Vermont, is managed with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they've had to implement a similar kind of rotation on that property. They lost the farmer. A lot of the fields reverted to goldenrod. They needed to put them back on a rotation for mowing to get them back into that grass condition. So there's a variety of projects that are happening statewide, but this initiative with the Lemon Fair and the Gorton Pastoral is really trying to take some of these new approaches and apply it to the WMAs that we have. So we're hoping to expand this work for sure once we see how things are going on the Lemon Fair.
Again, I want to urge anybody, if you have any last minute questions, we would welcome them at this point. I also want to just point out in the chat feature, if you look at it, I did put a link to the Audubon, Green Mountain Audubon Society, if you'd like to become a member or make donations to support our work. That's the. Phoebe had another question here. This is good. Has Fish and Wildlife Service ever discussed restoring some of these sites with native grassland seed to get more conservative species in there that might benefit the birds?
Yeah, no, there's definitely discussions around warm and cool season grasses and trying some different types of grasses. Seed sources can be really expensive to find some of those native seed sources for planting purposes. And our current management is more conducive to some of the species that we have on the landscape. So yes, we're thinking about it, but we haven't implemented it specifically in any spot yet on the ground.
Ken, I see you might have your hand raised. I'm not sure if you have a question, if you can put it in the chat.
I was going to do it verbally. Is that okay?
Oh, that's great. That's fine.
So Tom and I are both on the Conservation Commission in Georgia, and the certificate of public good specified that they couldn't do any work on that solar farm until August 15th. But I suppose the question is, that property is being lost to the habitat, and it doesn't appear as though there's any mitigation to quote unquote replace that property. So I'm a little bit troubled by the decision.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at the specifics for the project. We review many projects, and so to know the reasoning and why it landed the way it did, I would have to go back and look at the specifics. But feel free to reach out. Noel Dodge is our regulatory biologist that covers a lot of this work, and we'd be more than willing to share some of the information on that decision.
Great.
Thanks.
Well, it looks like I haven't seen any other questions. Jill, I have to say that the work that you do and the collaboration with other agencies that is going on right now is impressive, and it's inspiring, and hopefully it will have some positive impact. We all have to be hopeful in that regard. And so thank you for your work, and I want to thank you so much for your presentation here tonight. And thanks to all of you for joining us. We will have a presentation next month. Some of you may recall Zach Coda, who's actually out in Washington State right now. He's going to make a presentation on rare birds in Vermont. And then we have an outing planned on March 15th, a Lake Watch, and looking at hopefully some grebes and other species making their way back to breeding grounds, and hopefully we'll catch some in breeding plumage at that point. But Jill, again, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you so much for your hard work, and we really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for everybody for attending. Great to see so many.
Thank you, everybody, and we really appreciate you coming to our program. Have a great day, and stay warm. All right, bye-bye now.